Do you think you could survive a day as a medieval peasant? Try it. The modern world has accustomed us to comfort, accessibility of information, and predictability. Our days are scheduled down to the hour, our homes are protected from the elements, and food is available at any time of the day. We have grown accustomed to taking these blessings for granted, without thinking about what life was like just a few centuries ago. A medieval village was a world where time flowed differently, where every day was a struggle for survival, and where the simple things we take for granted were unattainable luxuries. Everyday life at that time consisted of monotonous, exhausting labor that continued from dawn to dusk. Every aspect of life, from building a home to preparing food, was permeated by necessity and practicality. Watch this video to the end, and you will learn why a common nail was valued as much as silver, and how a simple household item could reveal more about a family's social status and wealth than their clothes or home. Imagine a morning without an alarm clock. Your awakening depends not on the exact time, but on the first light shining through the cracks in the wall or the insistent crowing of a rooster. Medieval peasants lived in a world where the very concept of personal, measurable time did not exist, and their day was governed by the great natural clock. This internal biological rhythm, completely synchronized with the environment, shaped a worldview that was fundamentally different from ours. Time was cyclical and measured by the position of the sun, the phases of the moon, and the changing seasons. The only artificial reference point was the church bell, but even that did not measure hours, but rather stages of life common to all, such as the call to prayer or the signal to start work. This sound was not a chronometer, but the pulse of the community, synchronizing the actions of hundreds of people in a single flow. In essence, there were two times: personal, natural, and social, dictated by the church. The day was divided into simple and understandable segments: dawn, morning, noon, evening, and sunset. These intervals determined the rhythm of work and rest, time for prayer and meals. There was no need for greater precision because the main task was to complete all the work before dark. The sun was the main overseer, its position in the sky dictating the intensity and nature of the work. The concepts of hurrying or being late had a completely different, more significant meaning. They were related more to seasonal work than to a specific time, and the price of such a mistake was measured not in money, but in the threat of starvation for the whole family. Being late with sowing meant risking the seedlings, and delaying the harvest meant losing the crop to the autumn rains. Success depended on the ability to feel the natural rhythm, not on the ability to meet a schedule. Distances were also perceived differently, and the world seemed both small and boundless at the same time. The distance to the neighboring village was measured not in kilometers, but in the amount of time and effort it took to walk there. Physical fatigue and the number of daylight hours were the main measures of distance, turning any journey into a serious undertaking. Every trip to the market was an event in itself, one that required advanced preparation and took up the entire daylight hours. A peasant's world was limited to his village, fields, forest, and perhaps the nearest town. Everything beyond this circle was a distant and almost mythical space, full of unknowns. News from the outside world arrived weeks or even months late, transmitted by rare traders or pilgrims. This information, retold many times, often turned into rumors and legends, loosely connected to reality. This deep isolation shaped a unique worldview where the community played a key role. Everyone was visible, their actions and deeds known to all, and the concept of a private life, hidden from prying eyes, simply did not exist.
No, not really.
The lack of personal space in the modern sense was compensated for by a constant sense of solidarity and collective responsibility. A person's reputation in the eyes of their neighbors was their main asset. Every member of the community knew that their personal survival depended directly on the coordinated actions of everyone else. This interdependence was not a voluntary choice, but a harsh necessity, the foundation of the entire social order. Helping a neighbor was not an act of goodwill, but an investment in one's own future. I would be very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about this perception of time and space? Write about it in the comments. A peasant's working day began in the deep pre-dawn mist, when the earth was still frozen by the night cold. The awakening was abrupt and devoid of any comfort, immediately plunging a person into harsh reality. There was no time for a slow awakening, because every moment of daylight lost was an irreplaceable loss. As soon as a peasant's consciousness was freed from sleep, it immediately focused on the most important task. It was not to satisfy one's own hunger or thirst, but to light a fire in the hearth. It was this sacred ritual that determined whether the house would be warm, light, and have hot food for the whole family. This was not just a domestic ritual, but a fundamental act that started a new day. Without fire, the house remained only a cold and dark shelter, unfit for life. Therefore, taming the flames was the main duty with which every morning began. The process of obtaining fire in the absence of matches was a true art, requiring enormous patience and movements honed to perfection. The main tools were a piece of hard flint and a steel striker, which were guarded like the apple of one's eye. The success of the whole enterprise depended on the quality of dry tinder, a special material capable of igniting from a single spark. It was carefully stored in a dry place, as damp tinder was completely useless. The man made sharp, sliding strokes with the flint striker on the flint, producing a shower of bright sparks. It was necessary to catch at least one of them on the surface of the tinder so that it would ignite into a tiny flame. This skill was vital, and it was taught from early childhood. The ability to quickly light a fire in any conditions was one of the main indicators of maturity and thriftiness. The secrets of this craft were passed down from father to son, from generation to generation. As soon as the dry logs began to burn, the single room of the peasant dwelling was quickly filled with thick, acrid smoke. It stung the eyes and made it difficult to breathe, but it was an inevitable evil that had to be endured every morning. Only after a while did the smoke find its way out through a hole in the roof. The steady crackling of the burning wood served as a wake-up call for the rest of the family. Women and children rose from their straw mattresses, shivering in the morning cold. Another long and hard day of endless work awaited them. The house was a living organism that breathed and reacted to changes in temperature. The precious heat provided by the hearth constantly sought to escape through the numerous cracks in the walls. Therefore, the struggle to preserve heat was as important a task as its production. The peasant hut itself was the embodiment of asceticism and functionality, built from the most accessible natural materials. Its walls were often constructed using the mazanka technique, where a wooden frame was filled with a mixture of clay and straw. Such a structure was far from perfect, but it provided the necessary protection from wind and rain. The floor in the dwelling was earthen, simply carefully tamped down to make it level. It always remained cold and damp, so it was often sprinkled with a layer of straw for warmth. The interior spoke of a complete absence of even a hint of luxury or comfort. All the furnishings consisted of a roughly nailed table and several similar benches. The sleeping places were mattresses stuffed with dry straw, which were spread out on the floor or on wooden platforms at night. That was all a peasant family had. The breakfast that the woman prepared on the burning hearth had nothing to do with pleasure. Its sole and main purpose was to provide the body with enough energy for the upcoming exhausting work. The menu was monotonous from day to day, year after year. Most often, the table was set with simple porridge cooked in water from the cheapest and most accessible grains. It could be barley, oats, or millet, depending on the region and the harvest. Such food was practically tasteless, but it was high enough in calories to provide strength for several hours of hard labor. This morning meal was not a ritual, but a necessary fuel for the body. Every bite eaten was a guarantee that a person would have enough strength to plow, sow, or mow. Therefore, food was treated from a practical point of view, without expecting any gastronomic variety from it. The undisputed basis of the entire diet was black rye bread, which was revered almost as a sacred object. It was treated with great respect, and not a single crumb was allowed to fall on the floor. Bread was a symbol of life, prosperity, and hard peasant labor. The process of making it was very long and required enormous effort, mainly from women. First, the grain had to be ground into flour on heavy hand mills, then kneaded into stiff dough. The bread was baked directly in the hot ashes of the hearth, and each loaf was valued incredibly highly. This simple meal was usually washed down with clean spring water, if there was a source nearby. Often, low-alcohol, heavily diluted beer or kvass was used as a drink. Such drinks were safer than water from some stagnant reservoirs. The short morning meal was always eaten in concentrated silence. Time at dawn was too precious a resource to waste on idle conversation. Each member of the family ate their portion in silence, mentally preparing for the day's tasks ahead. Immediately after the meal, there was an unspoken but strict division of responsibilities. No orders or instructions were needed because everyone, from the youngest to the oldest, knew their role in the family mechanism from childhood. This order was unshakable and ensured the smooth running of the entire household. Men and grown sons took their simple tools, plows, scythes, axes. Without unnecessary words or delays, they set off to work in the fields, which was the basis of their lives. It was their labor in the fields that determined whether the family would have a harvest and food for the winter. Women had no less difficult and responsible work in running the household. They were responsible for caring for the few livestock, keeping the fire burning in the hearth, and of course, cooking. In addition, they tended the garden, spun yarn, and sewed clothes. Thus, as soon as the first rays of the sun illuminated the earth, the continuous conveyor belt of peasant labor began. This cycle did not stop for a minute and ended only when the thick twilight made further work impossible. The life of a peasant was completely subordinated to this relentless rhythm. Every day was filled with a multitude of concerns on which his own survival and that of his loved ones depended. What was the peasant's main concern as soon as he opened his eyes? In the next chapter, we will take a detailed look at the tools that were an extension of his hands and the key to his survival. The tools used by medieval peasants were extremely simple, but the survival of the family depended directly on their serviceability. Each item was the result of long manual labor and was of enormous material value. These tools were made to serve more than one generation and were therefore treasured as the greatest treasure. Made from the most accessible materials, wood and iron, they were often passed down from father to son. The breakage, or even worse, the loss of a tool, was a real tragedy for the entire household. After all, ordering a new plowshare or axe from a blacksmith required giving up a significant portion of the harvester savings. A heavy wooden plow occupied a central place in fieldwork, without which it was impossible to imagine plowing the land. Its design had not changed for centuries, consisting of a sturdy wooden frame and a small metal tip. This plowshare was the most valuable part of the plow, as iron was an expensive and rare resource. Working with such a primitive tool required incredible physical effort and complete dedication. The plow did not turn the soil, but only furrowed it, forcing the farmer to pass over the same place several times. Day after day, man and his draft animals, whether oxen or horses, merged into a single exhausting effort. When harvest time came, the sickle and scythe became the main tools. A small sickle with a characteristic curved blade was used to harvest precious grain crops. The work was painstaking and very slow, as the ears of grain had to be cut into small bunches. Every day during the harvest, the peasant spent many hours in a bent position under the scorching sun, which caused severe back pain. Unlike the sickle, the scythe, with its long blade and handle, was used to harvest hay for the winter. Working with a scythe required not so much meticulousness as broad rhythmic movements and enormous physical endurance. The axe was rightly considered the most versatile and indispensable tool in any peasant household. It was an extension of a man's arm, his faithful companion in the dense forest and during construction. With the help of an axe, they harvested firewood for the hearth, cut down trees for building a hut, and repaired the fence around their land. Proficiency with this tool was absolutely essential for every man who wanted to provide for his family. The quality and durability of the axe depended directly on its metal part, forged by a village blacksmith. This working part was expensive, and it was attached to a sturdy, comfortable handle, which the peasant often made himself. A peasant's working day was completely dependent on the movement of the sun across the sky. It began with the first timid rays breaking through in the east and did not end until thick twilight enveloped the earth. There was no such thing as weekends or holidays in the modern sense, because every fine day was a priceless gift for work. The rhythm of life was determined by the changing seasons, which dictated their own immutable laws. Spring was a time of hope, hard plowing, and careful sowing, laying the foundations for future prosperity. Summer was a time of monotonous weed control and exhausting haymaking under the scorching sun. Autumn brought with it the most intense period, the harvest, when it was necessary to mobilize all forces to gather the crops. With the onset of winter, fieldwork came to a standstill, but that did not mean it was time to rest. Peasants repaired worn-out tools, prepared firewood for the long months ahead, and repaired buildings damaged by bad weather. The process of plowing the land was rightly considered one of the most exhausting physical tests. The peasant and his draft animals were a single mechanism, moving slowly and persistently across the field. Controlling a team of oxen or a single horse required constant attention and loud commands. The primitive plow only scratched the top layer of soil, forcing the same area to be plowed over and over again. Often, the plowshare would hit stones or roots, and the whole structure would shake, requiring enormous effort from the plowman to hold it steady. The man leaned his entire weight on the handles to ensure that the furrow was straight and deep enough. By the end of a day spent behind the plow, the farmer felt completely exhausted. Every muscle in his body ached from the inhuman strain, and his hands were covered with calluses. This work continued for weeks, taking all his strength without leaving anything behind. When the field was ready, it was time to sow, which was done exclusively by hand. The farmer slung a heavy bag filled to the brim with selected grain, the family's main hope, over his shoulder. He walked across the plowed land, making measured movements honed by years of experience. A lot depended on how evenly the seeds were sown in the ground. Too dense a sowing would cause the plants to interfere with each other, while too sparse a sowing would mean a loss of part of the harvest. Therefore, this process required extreme concentration and an intuitive understanding of the work. Every grain thrown into the ground was strictly accounted for, because it was a reserve that could be used for food. A sower's mistake could only become apparent months later, and by then it was too late to correct it. Thus, one person bore the responsibility for feeding the entire family for a year to come. The harvest was the culmination of the entire agricultural year, a time of great tension and collective labor. The entire community, from teenagers to the elderly, went out to the fields because every pair of hands was needed. The main task was to harvest the crops before the long autumn rains began. Everyone understood that delay or bad weather could destroy the results of many months of labor in an instant. Men and women worked from morning to night with sickles, cutting the ears of grain and tying them into sheaves. The atmosphere was filled with both hope for a full winter and fear of not finishing in time. Losing even part of the harvest meant the threat of starvation, so people worked to the limit of their abilities, forgetting their fatigue. What emotions do you think the peasant felt when he looked at his field? In the next chapter, you will learn what the house he lived in looked like. The dwelling of a medieval peasant was built not for comfort, but for basic survival. Its main purpose was to protect against the weather, wild animals, and the cold of night. Therefore, every element of the structure was subject to the strict logic of functionality and resource conservation. Most often, it was a simple one-room hut that the family built themselves from materials available nearby. In wooded areas, the main material was roughly hewn logs stacked on top of each other. In other regions, a wooden frame was erected, which was then tightly coated with a mixture of clay, straw, and manure. This technique, known as mazanka, created surprisingly strong and warm walls. The roof was usually covered with a thick layer of straw or reeds, which provided good insulation. However, such roofs often leaked and required regular repairs after heavy rain or snowfall. The interior of the house was almost always plunged into thick semi-darkness. This was because the windows were deliberately made small and placed as sparsely as possible. Any window opening was a source of significant heat loss, which was an unaffordable luxury during the cold season. Instead of expensive and inaccessible glass, more primitive materials were used. The windows could be covered with a piece of oiled canvas or a carefully crafted and stretched ox bladder. Such glass allowed only a little dim light to pass through, but at least provided some protection from the wind. The only real source of light and heat was an open hearth. It was placed right in the center of the room, which allowed the heat to spread more or less evenly throughout the room. The whole family gathered around this fire in the evenings. It was the heart of their modest home. Since there was no chimney in the usual sense, all the smoke from the hearth rose upward. It slowly escaped through a special hole in the roof or simply seeped through the cracks in the thatched roof. Because of this, the air in the room was heavy, saturated with acrid smoke and soot. Over time, all surfaces inside the house were covered with a thick layer of black, sticky soot. The ceiling beams, walls, and few utensils had a characteristic sooty appearance. This feature of everyday life led to frequent respiratory diseases among all family members. The floor in a peasant hut was earthen, simply carefully tamped down to a solid state. To insulate it somewhat and maintain a semblance of hygiene, the floor was periodically covered with a layer of fresh straw. Sometimes dry fragrant herbs such as wormwood or thyme were mixed into the straw for aroma and to repel insects. Without exception, the entire life of the family was concentrated within this single room. There was no division into zones. The space was transformed according to current needs. In the morning, they had breakfast here. In the afternoon, the women could spin, and in the evening, everyone gathered for dinner. The furnishings were extremely sparse and consisted only of the most necessary items. A roughly knocked-together table and several long benches along the walls served both for meals and for work. The most valuable items, if there were any, were kept in a large wooden chest with a lock. At night, this same room was turned into a shared bedroom for all the household members. People slept on straw mattresses spread out directly on the earthen floor or on wide wooden platforms, lofts. Often, during severe frosts, newborn lambs or calves were brought here for the night to save the young from death. Although the main and most visible work in the fields did indeed fall on the shoulders of men, women's work was no less exhausting and absolutely indispensable. It consisted of a continuous cycle of duties that did not depend on the season. While men's work was subject to the agricultural seasons, women's work did not stop for a single day. A peasant woman's duties began long before the first rays of sunlight illuminated the hut and did not end even after supper. She was the first to get up to light the fire in the hearth and the last to go to bed, making sure that everything was ready for the next day. Her responsibilities covered all aspects of domestic life, from cooking to raising children. Women were the guardians of the hearth in the truest sense of the word. It was their diligence, knowledge, and physical endurance that determined whether the family would be fed, clothed, and healthy. This daily monotonous labor was the foundation on which the entire peasant economy rested. One of the most labor-intensive tasks was the daily preparation of food for a large family. This process began with a trip to the nearest well or river to fetch water, which had to be carried in heavy wooden buckets. Then it was necessary to light and maintain a fire in the hearth, which required skill and constant attention. Before baking bread or cooking soup, flour had to be obtained from grain. This was done using heavy hand mills, which took several hours of hard physical labor. Only then did the actual cooking process begin, using an open fire in a clay pot. In addition, women were responsible for preparing food for the long winter. They salted meat, dried mushrooms and berries, and fermented cabbage and other vegetables. Their knowledge in this area allowed the family to survive the cold months when fresh food was practically unavailable. Providing clothing for the family was also entirely the responsibility of women. The entire process, from processing raw materials to sewing the finished product, was done by hand. First, long evenings were spent spinning threads from sheep's wool or flax fibers using a spindle. When enough yarn was ready, it was time to weave on a primitive home loom. Creating even a few meters of coarse but durable fabric was a long and painstaking task. From this fabric, women sewed simple shirts, pants, and dresses for all the household members. Mending clothes was no less an important part of her duties, as each item was highly valued. Old clothes were mended countless times until they were finally worn out. Not a single scrap of fabric was wasted, as it was used for patches or rags. In addition to household chores, women were responsible for a small vegetable garden near the house. There she grew turnips, cabbage, onions, and other vegetables, which were an important addition to the grain diet. In addition, she regularly went to the forest to gather wild berries, edible roots, and medicinal herbs. During the most crucial periods of the agricultural year, women worked in the fields alongside men. During sowing, they helped scatter grain, and during the harvest, they worked with sickles from dawn to dusk. Without their participation, it would have been impossible to gather the entire harvest in time before the rains came. Thus, women's labor, although less visible to outsiders, was critical to survival. She was a cook, weaver, seamstress, gardener, and healer all rolled into one. Which of the women's duties do you think was the most difficult? In the next chapter, we will talk about the relationship between the peasant and the community and the Lord. Medieval peasants were never isolated individuals because it was practically impossible to survive alone. They were an integral part of the rural community, which functioned as a single complex organism. This community dictated the rhythm of life and behavior, subordinating personal interests to collective needs. Life in the community was based on strict, unwritten laws, passed down from generation to generation. The shared use of communal lands, such as pastures, forests, and water bodies, required precise coordination among all members. For example, there were strict rules governing when livestock could be taken out to pasture or when haymaking could begin. Any conflicts that arose, whether disputes over boundaries or crop damage, were resolved within the community. The main body was the general meeting of householders, where everyone could express their opinion. The village elder, usually the most respected and experienced person in the settlement, played a key role in resolving disputes. Legally, all the land on which the peasant worked did not belong to him, but was owned by the feudal lord. The lord was the absolute master, and the peasants were merely holders of allotments. For the right to live and work on this land, the peasant was obliged to perform numerous duties. The main and most difficult form of labor was corvée. It was forced labor, during which the peasant had to work several days a week on the lord's field. At the same time, he was obliged to use his own tools and draft animals, which wore out both. The most fertile and best lands were usually set aside for the lord's plowing. Peasants were forced to work their lord's fields first, often to the detriment of their own plots. This meant that they had much less time and energy left for their own farms. In addition to corvée labor, there was another form of servitude, tribute, which was a tax in kind. After the harvest, the peasant was obliged to give the lord a predetermined share of the produce. The amount of tribute was determined solely by the feudal lord and his steward. The best part of the harvest was sent to the lord's barns, selected grain, vegetables, and fresh hay. In addition, the tithe included other products produced on the farm: poultry, eggs, milk, honey, and homespun cloth. This levy was regular and inevitable. Often, the amount of tribute was so large that after paying it, the peasant family was left with only the bare minimum. This was barely enough to feed themselves until the new harvest and leave seeds for sowing. Any bad harvest year in such conditions could cause real famine. The life of a simple farmer was completely and utterly dependent on the will and mood of his master. Peasants were tied to the land and were not allowed to leave their native village without special permission. Attempting to escape was considered a serious crime and was severely punished. The peasant's personal life was also under control. For example, he could not marry a girl from another village belonging to another feudal lord without the consent of his lord. Such permission often had to be paid for with an additional ransom. The lord also had supreme judicial power on his land. He settled all disputes between his peasants and judged them for theft and other offenses. The feudal lord could impose any punishment at his discretion, from fines to corporal punishment, and his decision was final. The diet of a medieval peasant was a direct reflection of his dependent position and limited opportunities. It was characterized by extreme scarcity, monotony, and complete dependence on the whims of nature. Survival depended on what could be grown on one small plot of land. The main source of calories needed for hard physical labor was grain crops. The basis of the crops was unpretentious rye, barley, and oats, which could grow even on poor soils. Wheat, which required more fertile land, was rare and considered a sign of prosperity. Everything that could be gathered in the surrounding forest or meadows served only as a small supplement to the main food. Mushrooms, berries, and wild edible herbs added some variety to the menu. However, these gifts of nature were strictly seasonal and could not form the basis of the diet. Bread occupied a central place on the table, both on weekdays and on holidays. It was baked from coarsely ground rye flour, often without sifting out the bran. In lean years, quinoa or even crushed acorns could be mixed into the flour to increase the volume of the baked goods. In addition to bread, grain was used to make various porridges and soups, which formed the basis of breakfast and dinner. It was simple but filling food that allowed people to get through a long working day. Often, such a soup was the only hot meal a peasant ate all day. Meat was a real delicacy and appeared on the peasant's table only a few times a year. As a rule, this happened on major church holidays, such as Christmas or Easter, when a pig was slaughtered. At other times, meat consumption was extremely rare. Some variety was added to the monotonous menu by vegetables grown in the garden. The main crops that peasants planted were the most unpretentious and high-yielding. Turnips, cabbage, peas, beans, and various types of onions formed the basis of gardening. In summer and autumn, vegetables were eaten fresh or added to soups to make them thicker and more filling. However, the main task was to preserve them for the long and hungry winter. The main methods of preservation were salting, pickling, and drying. Fruit, mostly wild or semi-cultivated apples, pears, and plums, was only a seasonal treat. They were eaten fresh in late summer and fall, but did not play a significant role in the overall diet. It was practically impossible to preserve them fresh for the winter. Dairy products were only available to families who were lucky enough to have a cow or at least a few goats on their farm. Milk was extremely valuable and a source of much-needed protein. It was rarely drunk in its pure form, but was most often processed into more durable products. Milk was used to make simple cottage cheese and fresh cheese, which could be stored for some time. However, a significant portion of dairy products did not make it to the peasant family's table. It was sent as natural tribute to the feudal lord's granaries or sold at the nearest market. Fish could have been a good addition to the diet, but its availability was limited. Even if a village was located on the banks of a river or lake, the right to fish most often belonged to the lord. Peasants were generally forbidden to fish on the lord's land under threat of severe punishment. The material world of a medieval peasant was extremely limited and restricted to only the bare necessities. All of his economic activity was aimed not at accumulation, but at simply sustaining life and fulfilling his duties. The idea of wealth or owning beautiful things was completely foreign and unattainable to him. Items that seem commonplace today, such as glassware, metal cutlery, or mirrors, were a real luxury for peasants. Their daily life was devoid of any decorations, and all things were valued solely in terms of their practical use. Aesthetics played virtually no role in their lives. The entire environment and property of a peasant family clearly reflected their position at the lowest rung of the feudal hierarchy. The absence of excess was the norm, and anything not directly related to survival or work was considered unnecessary. This asceticism was not a philosophical choice, but a harsh necessity of life. Peasant clothing was extremely functional and designed to protect against the weather and hard work. It was made from coarse but durable fabrics that women produced at home. The main materials were flax, which was grown on their own land, and wool obtained from a few sheep. Men's attire usually consisted of a long canvas shirt, which was worn loose and tied with a rope or belt. This was complemented by simple trousers and, in the cold season, a cloak made of thick woolen fabric. Women wore a long shirt down to their feet, over which they wore a sarafan or sleeveless dress. The color range of clothing was very limited, as complex dyes were expensive and inaccessible. Fabrics retained their natural color, grayish for linen and brown or white for wool. The same clothes were worn for years, constantly mended, and when they became too small, they were passed on to younger children in the family. Wearing shoes all the time was a privilege for wealthy people, not an everyday norm for peasants. For most of the warm season, from spring to late autumn, all family members went barefoot. Over the years of walking on the ground, stubble and stones, the skin on their feet became rough and insensitive. In cold or rainy weather, as well as for hard work in the forest, peasants used the simplest footwear. These could be porshni, primitive shoes made from a single piece of rawhide and fastened with a strap. In some regions, wooden clogs were also common, which protected the feet but were very heavy. Any footwear, even the roughest, was considered valuable and was taken great care of. It was uncomfortable, rubbed the feet, and did not allow them to breathe, but it provided the necessary protection. Losing or damaging footwear was a serious problem, as it was not easy to make new ones. If you look inside a peasant's house, apart from the simplest furniture and work tools, the set of utensils was minimal. On the shelves, you could see a few clay pots for cooking food on the hearth. Wooden bowls and spoons were also in use, which every man could carve for his family himself. The only item intended for storage was a large, heavy wooden chest. It was used to store the most valuable clothes, a small supply of grain, and possibly some craft tools. The chest was often the only lockable item in the house, protecting the meager possessions from outsiders. Every item in the household, from a clay pot to a wooden spoon, was highly valued. Things were not bought in stores, but were created through the long and painstaking labor of family members. That is why property was treated with such care, repaired until the last possible moment, and never thrown away if it could still be used. When the last rays of the sun disappeared behind the horizon and the fields were plunged into thick twilight, the hard work stopped. Working in the dark was not only impossible, but also dangerous, so the whole family slowly made their way home. This short journey from the field to the hut was the only moment of transition from exhausting labor to a short rest. The family returned to their only refuge, a dark and perpetually smoky house with heavy air. The woman immediately set about preparing a meager dinner, stoking the hearth that had gone out during the day. The men sitting closer to the fire used the last hours of the day for important household chores. By the dim light of the hearth, they carried out small but necessary repairs to ensure they were ready for the next day. Some repaired shovel handles, some sharpened sickle blades, and some wove simple bast shoes from bark. This quiet, focused work was as integral a part of the evening as the meal itself. The composition of a peasant's dinner differed little from that of breakfast or lunch. Most often, it was the same thick soup made from grain and vegetables that was left over from lunch. It was served with the obligatory piece of coarse rye bread, which formed the basis of the meal. Wax or tallow candles were an unaffordable luxury, available only to the church or the manor house. Therefore, the only source of light in a peasant's hut was the living fire in the hearth. In its dim, constantly flickering light, the whole family spent this short evening time. The family dined in silence, gathered in a tight circle around the fire, which provided not only light but also precious warmth. The flickering flames cast bizarre shadows on the walls, creating a special atmosphere of peace after a hard day. It was a time when one could sit in silence and gather one's strength. The concept of entertainment in the modern sense simply did not exist for medieval peasants. Any activity had to be of practical use, so even leisure was closely intertwined with work. On long, dark winter evenings, when there was no field work to be done, people found things to do at home. Men could spend hours carving useful household items out of wood, spoons, bowls, children's toys. Women, on the other hand, almost never parted with their spindles, tirelessly spinning wool or linen threads. This monotonous work by the light of the hearth was the backdrop for the few family conversations that took place. Sometimes, if they weren't too tired, one of the elders would tell old tales or legends. Sometimes the whole family would quietly sing long, sad songs that had been passed down from one generation to the next. But more often than not, after a whole day of physical labor, people didn't have the energy for conversation or singing. As soon as dinner was eaten and the most urgent tasks were completed, the family began to prepare for bed. They went to sleep very early, almost immediately after sunset, obeying the natural rhythm of nature. This was dictated not only by fatigue, but also by the harsh necessity of conserving resources. Every log for the hearth was obtained through hard work, so burning fire unnecessarily was considered wasteful. Sleep was the only completely free and accessible way to restore the strength spent during the day. It gave the body the necessary respite before facing new challenges. Thus, a simple sleep on a straw mattress marked the end of a typical day in the life of a medieval peasant. It was indistinguishable from hundreds of previous and hundreds of subsequent days of his life of deprivation. This endless cycle of hard work, meager food, and short rest constituted the essence of his existence. We have completed our immersion into a day in the life of a medieval peasant. This reality, devoid of the comforts we are accustomed to, shows how much the world and our perception of life have changed. Labor, which for us is only part of the day, was the very meaning of existence for them. And the simple things that we do not notice were valued as much as gold. Their world was harsh, but it had its own harmony, subject to the rhythms of nature. The ability to read the signs of the surrounding world, understand the land, and work in harmony with it was the key to survival. This experience, accumulated over generations, allowed our ancestors to get through the most difficult times and lay the foundation for the future in which we live. What other eras or aspects of medieval life would you like to see in our future videos? Suggest your topics in the comments, and maybe your idea will be the basis for the next episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on new journeys into history.